To start, I wanted to show you an ad that was posted here on MIT campus by an entrepreneur who was looking to hire software engineers. And I wanted to start with this ad because I think it's very telling of some of the status dynamics that I'm going to be addressing in my paper. So one thing you might notice is that this person points out that they have access to venture capital. Perhaps not too surprising, given that we know that accessing venture capital is an important milestone for an entrepreneurial firm. But what I think is most telling is that this person leads their ad by pointing out that they're a Harvard entrepreneur. So they're not just any old entrepreneur. And presumably they're doing this because they anticipate that having this high status educational affiliation is going to be helpful in terms of their recruiting. So in my paper, I'm going to be looking at this very question in terms of what's the role of status understood as perceived quality based on social position on entrepreneurs' ability to recruit. So the idea that workers may be attracted to high-status firms is not new. It's something that's been speculated about in the literature, at least since Podolny 1993's article on status-based competitive advantage. However, existing evidence on this point is based exclusively on analyses of realized employment relationships. And so prior scholars have examined what workers firms of different status employ. And what this literature generally finds is a pattern of firm-worker matching on status, meaning that more prestigious firms tend to employ workers with more prestigious backgrounds. And how this has been interpreted in the literature is as reflecting a preference for high status on both sides of the market. So the idea is that if both firms and workers prefer high status, this is going to tend to restrict hiring to firms and workers of similar status. And so I begin my argument by defining a recruiting advantage specifically to mean that high-status firms do better in terms of candidate attraction. And this draws very directly from Podolny, who argued that one of the reasons that high-status producers have a competitive advantage is that relationship opportunities simply flow to these producers. Or the flip side of that argument, which is that low-status firms have to work harder in order to attract the same talent. However, if we're looking at patterns of realized relationships, these patterns could indeed be coming from differences in the supply of candidates that different firms have access to. But this same pattern could also be coming from differences in firms' demand-side screening choices. As a result, interpreting realized relationships as evidence of a recruiting advantage requires that we assume that the pattern is at least partly driven by differences in candidate attraction. So at the extreme, we could envision a scenario where firms across the status spectrum have access to the exact same pools of workers, but for some reason, high-status firms are disproportionately selecting high-status workers. This could be because they get greater benefits from employing these workers, or it could also be because they have some kind of special cultural taste for workers with these types of credentials. And so what I argue is that if we want to assess a recruiting advantage, we need to look pre-hire. So we need to look beyond patterns of realized relationships and examine the relationship opportunities that are available to firms of different status. And so in my paper, what I do is I leverage a unique data set that allows me to compare the hiring opportunities across a sample of firms that vary with respect to their status. And when I say hiring opportunities, what I mean is things like the applicant pools that firms of different status attract, and also other recruiting outcomes, such as the yields that they achieve on their job offers. Furthermore, by looking at hiring opportunities across these different firms, I am also able to speak to different theories of workers' supply-side behavior. So some theories would suggest that the reason we see this pattern of firm-worker matching on status is that workers from across the status spectrum may have a preference for high-status firms, but in most cases, even though workers may try to access these firms, they're unsuccessful. They end up having to settle for lower status firms. But other theories suggest that either because of differences in access to different job opportunities or because of differences in preference for different types of job opportunities, what we may actually see is that workers display status homophily, or in other words, that workers seek out firms of similar status. And those theories are perhaps most famously exemplified by the market for lawyers, where scholars have argued there are really different hemispheres of the law, and these different hemispheres of the law have really very independent labor markets, where we would very rarely see, for instance, somebody who was trained at a low-status law school be targeting a high-status law firm. What's important to note is that both of these theories imply the same predictions in terms of the patterns of realized relationships. They're both consistent with this pattern of firm-worker matching on status. However, by examining the hiring opportunities that are available to different firms, I am actually able to inform which ones of these two sets of theories might be going on. So what I argue in the paper is that if there is a preference for high status or status homophily, those imply different predictions in terms of the recruiting outcomes that we might see at different stages of the hiring process. And just to give you an example, if we think about the applicant pools that different firms may have access to, if there's a preference for high status, what I argue is that what we should see is that high status firms have larger applicant pools, but not that they have larger shares of high status workers in their applicant pools. But if there's status homophily, what I argue is that what we should see is that applicant pools at higher status firms include higher shares of high status workers. And I argue that this matters to entrepreneurs because it suggests the extent of recruiting advantage that comes from the founder's background. Note that both of these theories suggest that high-status entrepreneurs are going to be more successful in terms of recruiting high-status workers, but the predictions mainly differ in terms of which type of firm is going to have an easier time recruiting low-status workers. In this context, recruiting low-status workers is important, first of all, because they're much easier to hire, and I find that in my paper, and second of all, because identifying high-quality, low-status workers is actually relatively easy in the context of software engineering, which is the context that I'm studying. And just to give you an example of that, I wanted to show you some profiles of what I would consider some low-status software engineers. So these are people who don't have prestigious educational pedigrees, but who perform very well on a coding challenge, and so well, in fact, that they impressed some tech companies that decided to hire them. So my point is that if low-status firms are at least not disadvantaged in terms of recruiting these types of workers, then that can potentially be a way for them to catch up in terms of recruiting. So I'm going to test these predictions using data from 978 software engineer job postings that I observed over a period of 52 months. These jobs correspond to 277 young and growing high-tech companies, mostly based in Silicon Valley. And it's important to note that these were, like I said, young and also relatively successful entrepreneurial firms. So I don't have time to talk a little bit more in detail about how I think about a status effect. I would just say that I think about it in a way that's very consistent with the literature. Why do I look at educational status? Here is an example of a founder of an entrepreneurial firm and this is his founder profile on his company website. And as you can see, very front and center is his educational background. Of course, anytime I examine this relationship accounting for a bunch of other factors that we might think are predictive of recruiting. Like I said, firm quality, perhaps most importantly, but also a number of other factors. Just to summarize my results, what I find in terms of applicant pools is that high-status firms attract larger applicant pools, but not larger shares of high-status workers. This is consistent with them having an across-the-board advantage and no homophily. In terms of job applicant screening, what I find is that high-status firms are more selective in terms of their screening, even when considering the same worker. Again, this is consistent with them having a recruiting advantage and there not being any homophily. And lastly, with respect to job offer yields, what I find is that high-status firms achieve better yields on their job offers among high-status workers. This is consistent with homophily, but what I argue in the paper is that it's most likely due to sorting of different workers to different firms. And so at the end of the day, what I end up finding is that high-status firms end up hiring higher shares of high-status workers. And I argue that this reveals that they have a recruiting advantage, because what I also find is that all firms want to hire high-status workers, even though these workers are much more harder to hire. And so the fact that these high-status firms are ending up with higher shares of these workers reveals a recruiting advantage, because they are accessing workers that are a priced resource in this market. So just to conclude, with respect to implications, so what I find is that old status hierarchies are being replicated in the new economy. So we already knew that status dynamics are pervasive in contexts like investment banking, the law, and academia, but to some degree we might have thought that high-tech entrepreneurship might have been different. For one thing, high-tech entrepreneurship is all about finding new ways of doing things, disrupting old business models. It's also a setting that's super competitive, certainly when it comes to hiring this type of talent. And it's a setting where there's a strong emphasis on demonstrated results. And what my findings imply is that even here, the rich get richer, as it were, when it comes to accessing talent. Thank you.